He was a good man. He was a good brother. He was a good dad. He didn't deserve what happened to him.
He'd been shot 8 times. One of his shoes had actually come off of him when he fell on the stairs. There was blood everywhere, and he was actually still alive.
They hunted him down like an animal, and they really wanted him dead.
They were heartless. It's like they didn't even care.
He wanted to retaliate back on my brother when he saw him again, and that's what happened. The young man wanted to get some payback.
June 11th, 2016, Atlanta, Georgia. At 3:17 a.m., DeKalb County Police and paramedics respond to a shooting at an apartment complex known as the Hamps.
Atlanta is, like a lot of big cities, violent. That's just the facts. In this particular community, that was even more intense because it's a lower income community, and violence, gangs, drug dealing were a part of daily life.
When they arrived, they found a man who had been shot approximately 8 times and was barely still alive. There was blood everywhere.
Authorities need to protect the crime scene.
You're going to have witnesses or just bystanders coming out of the woodwork to stand around. So the police had to secure the area and keep people from coming in and disturbing evidence.
As first responders rushed the victim to the hospital, police tried to identify him. Luckily, some of the bystanders recognized the victim from the neighborhood.
The victim was identified as Timothy Hobbs.
Timothy Hobbs was born in 1978 in a small town near Atlanta.
We grew up in Monticello, Georgia, a little country town. Everybody knows everybody.
Life in rural Georgia was peaceful and taught Timothy the importance of family.
Timothy was goofy, silly, fun to be around. Everything that a little sister can want in a big brother. We loved each other, and we were close, very close.
It's like a gentle, big teddy bear, you know, real kind-hearted, very protective of his family.
He was a good person. I mean, he would give you the shirt off of his back.
Timothy wanted nothing more than to have a family of his own, and he got a chance in his late 20s when he moved to Atlanta and met a single mother named Rhonda.
When Timothy met Rhonda, he fell deeply in love.
Rhonda had a daughter from a previous relationship, and it wasn't a problem for Timothy because he treated her like it was his own. For someone who couldn't wait to be a dad, it was the perfect situation. He was able to step in and be there for that little girl.
Then, in 2008, Timothy and Rhonda added a child of their own.
Timothy was an amazing father. He loved his little girl. He absolutely adored her. Everything that he did was for his little girl. Everything. In every way. I mean, if she calls and say, "Daddy, I need this," or "Daddy, can you come?" He was there. Every time. No hesitation. That was his baby.
Every time I talked to him, he was always talking about his daughter. He did anything he could to be there for her, and whatever, it was birthdays or whatever, he was always making sure she had the best party and everybody showed up.
That was what he was known for. That was how he was received by everyone that knew him as a proud father.
But as dedicated as they were to their children, Timothy and Rhonda's relationship had its ups and downs. For several years, they decided to live under separate roofs. Rhonda and the girls stayed in an apartment in the Hampps, while Timothy lived with family members.
He took care of my grandmother and my grandfather. He was staying with them, and he was making sure they was all right.
Whatever he could do or whatever they needed, he was there to help take care of them. Doctor's appointment, cutting grass, cooking, everything he could do, he done it.
Not only was he a father, but he also took care of his grandparents. So he really operated intergenerationally, trying to take care of people in his life that he loved.
When Timothy wasn't spending time with his daughters, he worked countless hours to provide for them.
He worked hard for a living. He worked both in manufacturing as well as in setting up concerts.
Timothy worked in production, helped setting up shows and different things for people that had different venues they were doing, and he worked helping set up things and stuff like that.
Timothy, he loved what he did in production. He had a passion for it. He was very passionate about what he did, and he did it well.
Then in 2016, 8 years after Timothy and Rhonda's daughter was born, they decided it was time to make a permanent commitment to their relationship.
Mr. Hobbs was engaged to the mother of his child, and he was in love and took care of them, nurtured them, had a loving relationship with them, and they intended on getting married.
Timothy, he was trying to do the right thing for his little girl. He wanted to be with the mother of his child. He wanted to be one happy family. He just wanted to be under the same roof as his little girl. Want to be there with her at all times.
But now those plans are in jeopardy. Timothy has been found shot several times, and his loved ones are just waking up to hear the news.
I got a call from my oldest brother. I was getting ready to go to work, so it was probably about 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. He told me that my brother had been shot. So me and my mom got up and went to Atlanta and met my brother there.
They were operating on him at the time, but we couldn't see him. My thoughts were always, maybe he just got shot in the arm or something. Didn't know how serious it was. We just waited. A few other family members came in, just praying and believing that everything would be okay.
As the family prays for Timothy's recovery, police begin searching the crime scene for clues.
It was a gruesome scene. There were bullet casings everywhere. There was blood down the stairwell. There was a shoe that seemed as if it belonged to Timothy Hobbs.
The shell casings recovered were .40 caliber shell casings. It's not that distinctive. It's fairly common.
Given the location of the body and the shell casings, investigators believe the shooter fired at Timothy from the bottom of the stairs while he was walking up.
This was a man that was shot in the back 8 times. Someone wanted him dead. Someone intended to kill him.
While surgeons at Atlanta's Grady Memorial Hospital operate on 37-year-old Timothy Hobbs, DeKalb County investigators try to determine who shot him and why. It does not appear that he lives in the apartment building where he was found, known as the Hampps.
But he didn't have keys to an apartment in that building.
Though the neighbors recognize him, none seem willing to cooperate with police.
In a lot of communities and in a lot of apartment complexes, people are reluctant to talk because they live there and they don't want any retribution. And in this case, it was very much the same.
A lot of people didn't want to get into it. So you know how it is. I saw something, but I'm gonna close my eyes because it's not my business or whatnot.
Most apartment buildings have security cameras. So the first thing they want to do is look at the tapes.
The building's management can't retrieve the footage over the weekend, so detectives will have to wait to review the recordings. They head to the hospital to check on Timothy and his family, where terrible news awaits.
I knew something was going on when they came in and they took their hats off. Normally when you see stuff on TV, they're about to deliver some news that you don't want to hear.
While Mr. Hobbs was at the hospital, he actually redlined once, and the doctors were able to bring him back. But there was too much damage, too much blood loss, and he finally passed away.
I just screamed. That was my big brother. Someone had taken away from me. That's all I could do. I couldn't do nothing but scream. My brother was gone. And for what reason, I don't know. I just knew he was gone. And wasn't coming back. I was hurt.
Like, that was my little brother, you know, and I'm big brother, so, you know, I always tried to protect my brother. But I couldn't protect him that night. You know, that always bothered me.
Despite their grief, Timothy's loved ones want to help in the investigation. They tell police he stays in the apartment building across the street with his fiancée, Rhonda. And they say he recently got into a fight in the neighborhood.
My brother, we had a conversation about 2 weeks before he passed, and he mentioned to me that he got into the altercation with someone, and he told me he got the best of him. You know, I don't know what brought on the altercation or whatnot personally, but I'm assuming that because my brother said he got the best of him, that the young man wanted to get some payback.
The family explains that Rhonda thinks the other man is responsible for Timothy's death, and she knows his first name, Derek.
I've never heard the name Derek until after this happened. So only information I got is that he was the one that shot my brother.
I didn't know him. I mean, my brother never talked about him.
But when investigators go to the apartment to talk to Rhonda, she isn't there.
That strikes police as a little strange. She's not at home, and she's not at the hospital. She could be laying low with the kids, but to an investigator, it's a red flag.
On Monday, June 13th, investigators meet with the apartment manager, who provides the surveillance footage from the night Timothy was shot. They quickly find what they're looking for.
There was a video of an individual who approached Mr. Hobbs prior to Mr. Hobbs being shot to death.
On the surveillance video, I saw my brother going across the parking lot, walking to another apartment, and shortly after you see another guy walking.
On the video, you can see the guy is holding something in his hand as he goes inside the stairwell.
It looked as if you could actually see the gun in his hand.
He hid behind the back of an apartment by a stairwell until my brother came out of the apartment.
Then, a series of gunshots ring out. Timothy calls out for help, and he yells a name. The shooter doesn't appear on camera again, but after the last shots are fired, a third man runs across the parking lot and into the stairwell.
You can tell from the emotion in this guy's voice that he knows Timothy. He's in shock and he doesn't know what to do.
It's not clear who the third man is, but based on the video evidence, the building manager is able to identify exactly who the shooter is.
The individual who is seen walking in the area where Mr. Hobbs was shot had a very distinct walk, described by some as kind of hunched over, kind of pigeon-toed. That person is identified as Derek Thurman.
It's the same name they got from Timothy's family. So they want to know everything they can about this guy.
The manager tells police Derek is a 25-year-old man who lives in the Hams.
He had quite the reputation for fighting and being confrontational.
The manager also says Derek was involved in another incident at the complex 3 months earlier.
We became aware that Mr. Thurman was shot during a shootout.
Two days after Timothy Hobbs was shot to death at an apartment building in East Atlanta, investigators have a suspect, 25-year-old Derek Thurman. And according to the property manager, it isn't the first time Derek has been involved in a shooting.
On March 13, 2016, Mr. Thurman was involved in an altercation. Shots were fired.
Derek was outside in the complex when a shootout broke out. He was hit multiple times in his leg and in his stomach.
He was wounded and other people were wounded as well. It's that level of violence where someone could be attacked, violently attacked during the day, in broad daylight.
Derek's injuries were so bad that he spent over a month in the hospital, and eventually they put a colostomy bag in.
In addition to the colostomy bag, the damage to his leg gave him a distinct limp.
Word on the street was that Derek has been looking for revenge ever since.
At this point, Derek has a colostomy bag, and not only is he bitter, he is angry at this person who shot him. He was big mad. Somebody had to pay.
Investigators go to Derek's apartment to question him, but he's not there. The next day, however, they do catch up with Timothy's fiancée, Rhonda.
She shows up at the apartment after a couple of days with their girls. Right away, it's clear that she didn't have anything to do with Timothy's death.
Rhonda tells police Timothy left the apartment around 12:30 a.m. the night of the shooting.
Timothy had a couple of friends in the complex that he hung out with, and that's what he told Rhonda he was doing when he went out.
She isn't sure which friend it was, but says it might have been a man named Chenard, who actually lives in a nearby building in the Hams.
That name immediately rings a bell, because they heard that name on a security video. Chenard's apartment is near the stairs where Timothy was shot. Rhonda says there's talk in the building that Timothy was visiting Chenard when the shooting happened.
Rhonda says there was definitely bad blood between Timothy and Derek.
Mr. Thurman was actually dating or seeing Rhonda's younger sister. When the police spoke with Mr. Hobbs' fiancée, they learned that Mr. Hobbs and Mr. Thurman had actually had an altercation just weeks earlier.
Mr. Thurman attacked him along with some other men and beat him to the point that he was bleeding.
Timothy held his own, and he won that fight.
Based on the timing, this is probably the same fight that Timothy told his brother about.
Rhonda can't remember why they were fighting, but according to her, Timothy couldn't have been the person who shot Derek.
Mr. Hobbs didn't own a gun, wasn't involved in any violent acts, wasn't involved in any kind of gang or drug activity, was a working man and a father.
The only reason he was at those apartments was because his daughter was there. But even though the apartments were bad, many times I was with my brother, he never had a weapon or anything that he felt he needed to protect himself with. It wasn't the person going around starting anything.
The family and everyone associated with the family, they don't believe at all that he had anything to do with Mr. Thurman being shot. In fact, when Mr. Thurman was shot, Mr. Hobbs wasn't even out at the Hamps during that time.
When investigators show Rhonda the security footage, she's able to give them another key piece of information: the name of the third man captured on video.
This is the guy that runs in after the last shot is fired to try to help Timothy. According to Rhonda, this is one of his good friends, Big John. So that's a great lead, because if anyone saw where Derek ran off to, it's probably him.
After speaking to Timothy Hobbs' fiancée, Rhonda, detectives have another lead to follow. A man known as Big John, who came to Timothy's aid after the shooting.
So police are talking to Big John, and he tells him that he and Timothy were hanging out like they usually do on the weekends.
So about 3 a.m., Mr. Hobbs decides he wants a beer before he turns in for the night. So not having any, like a lot of these neighborhoods, they have the local bootlegger, or what we used to call a candy man, person that sells and anything you want. So he goes to the bootlegger to get his beer.
Big John says Timothy was only gone for a few minutes when he heard the gunshots.
He immediately runs over there without a second thought. But by the time he gets to Timothy, the shooter is already gone. He calls for help and tries to keep Timothy awake until police get there. He can tell from all the blood that his friend is in seriously bad shape.
He doesn't know if the gunman was Derek Thurman, but says Timothy did mention running into him earlier that day.
Timothy told Big John that he walked past Derek at the complex, and he was mean-mugging him. That means Derek was already at the scene. So the question is, what happened between those two? The next person that the investigators want to talk to is the bootlegger. He is probably the last person to see Timothy before the shooting.
When police get the name of the bootlegger, another piece of the puzzle falls into place.
It's Chenard, the last guy Timothy called out to on the surveillance recording. So why is he just calling for help? Does he think Chenard set him up?
When police find Chenard, he agrees to tell them what he knows.
He seemed anxious to clear his name, but he also didn't want to be seen talking to cops. He immediately said he had nothing to do with Timothy's death.
According to Chenard, Timothy knocked on his door around 3:15 a.m.
He remembers selling him the beer, a six-pack, him leaving, and shortly thereafter, hearing shots.
He has no idea who's doing the shooting or who's being shot. His first instinct is to go and lock his door. Then he hears Timothy calling his name.
He comes out, he looks down, and he can see Mr. Hobbs sprawled out on the stairs, but he was breathing. He was alive. And so he called 911.
Unfortunately, Chenard says he didn't see who the shooter was either, but he must have been hiding in the stairwell, waiting for Timothy to come out.
Whoever shot Timothy was obviously lurking in the shadows. They were plotting and planning. They hunted him down like an animal, and they really wanted him dead.
Even without an eyewitness, Derek Thurman appears to be the only suspect. And his motive is confirmed once detectives find the report about his own shooting in March.
They'd investigated the shooting of Mr. Thurman about several months before Mr. Hobbs' death. And this detective says that Mr. Hobbs' name came up as a potential suspect.
And the anonymous tip must have made its way back to Derek.
I think he had to have thought that Hobbs either was the one that shot him or he had something to do with it. So he's had all this time to think about payback.
But detectives completely refute any notion that he was involved in shooting Mr. Thurman before that or anyone else.
But Timothy's name isn't the only thing in the report about the earlier shootout that catches their attention.
The report lists two different casings, a .380 and .40 caliber handgun. The .380 was used to shoot Derek. The .40 was used to shoot back.
That was significant as well, that the connection during the shootout where Mr. Thurman was shot and the actual shooting of Mr. Hobbs was that these .40 caliber shell casings were found at both crime scenes.
So they get the crime lab to rush the analysis on both sets of the bullets. Because if they match, they know that Derek's gun was the one that killed Timothy.
Atlanta police are looking for 25-year-old Derek Thurman, suspected of murdering Timothy Hobbs in retaliation for an earlier shooting police don't think Timothy was responsible for. As detectives canvass the neighborhood for leads, they come across an associate of Derek's named Andre.
Andre doesn't want to say anything to police, especially not about Derek, but they eventually get him to talk.
He was out with Derek Thurman that night, those early morning hours of June the 11th in 2016.
Mr. Thurman was known to hang out in the breezeway all day, all night, drinking, as he did the night of the homicide.
At the same time, Timothy was on his beer run to Chenard's. Andre says at one point Derek told him, "I'll be right back." And as he walked away, Andre heard him mutter something under his breath.
He said, "There's that mother."
Andre didn't know who Derek was talking about, but under the circumstances, it seems pretty likely he spotted Timothy.
Andre says after Derek left, he decided to head back to his apartment.
And shortly thereafter, gunshots are heard. That is significant circumstantial evidence that Mr. Thurman is going after Mr. Hobbs.
Mr. Thurman was known to carry a .40 caliber pistol with him in the neighborhood. Matter of fact, the night of the homicide, Mr. Thurman had a .40 caliber pistol.
Andre claims he doesn't know anything about the shooting, but when investigators press him, he admits Derek had it out for Timothy. And Andre knows more about the earlier altercation between the two.
The story goes that Timothy bought some drugs from a man named Little Ham, and someone stole those drugs from Timothy. He thought it was Little Ham running some sort of hustle, and he confronted him. So Derek was friends with this guy, Little Ham, and didn't like that. So Derek confronted Timothy.
Not long after that fight, Derek got shot.
At this point, Derek has a colostomy bag. He is angry. He wants to seek payback for whoever did this to him.
Jump to the night of the shooting. He's out drinking with his buddy and sees Timothy walking into that stairwell alone. He's never gonna get a better shot.
When investigators get the results of the ballistics tests on the casings from the shootout where Derek was injured and those from Timothy's murder, their theory is confirmed.
Those shell casings, crime lab has put those together, and those shell casings match, meaning they came from the same weapon.
It looked like a clear-cut revenge killing. But the tragic thing is, he probably got the wrong guy. It was never any proof that Timothy was the one who shot Derek.
Mr. Hobbs' family is really clear that he was not involved in any violence. He didn't have any history of violence. The night that he was shot, he didn't have a gun on him.
Investigators now have enough evidence to arrest Derek Thurman. There's only one problem. They still can't find him.
He was doing his very best to elude capture. So detectives, fugitive squads are looking for Mr. Thurman. They're looking for months.
So it was encouraging to know that they still looking for the guy, but no one knew where he was.
The more time that goes by, the more chances they have to hide, the further away they can get from you, the more time they have to cover their tracks.
It was just me waiting on the day for somebody to call and said they got somebody. I mean, months just passing by, not knowing where he was or if he was coming after us. I mean, it was scary because we didn't know what his next move was gonna be. We didn't know. It was just scary.
It was a living hell for the family because they didn't know what he was going to do. They did not want anyone coming to try to take them out because of their relationship to Mr. Hobbs. And so it was just a time of fear.
Then on November 16th, 5 months after Timothy's murder, Derek finally turns up.
The police eventually catch up with Derek, who is in North Dakota. He had gotten there by a Greyhound bus, which takes approximately 24 hours from Atlanta to North Dakota.
He apparently went to a hospital in Bismarck, and while he was there, he dropped his ID card. When it was found, police ran his name and discovered he was wanted for murder. They were able to find the address where he was staying and arrested him without incident.
Derek informed the police that he was not on the run. He was there to seek medical attention for his colostomy bag. I don't know about you, but I don't know of anyone who would ride on a Greyhound bus to seek medical attention.
On December 2nd, Derek Thurman is extradited back to DeKalb County to face trial.
You would think the case would be open and shut, but most of what they had was circumstantial. They can put him at the scene, but they can't prove that he pulled the trigger.
On October 9th, 2017, Derek Thurman's trial gets underway. He's charged with the murder of 37-year-old Timothy Hobbs.
So many shootings happen in this area on a daily basis that there's barely any media coverage.
It was a few people that he knew that was there, maybe like 2 or 3. It wasn't packed at all. It was us, the jurors, and a few people on his side, and me and my mother and my cousin. The first day when he came in the courtroom, he looked and turned his head. I mean, because we were right there when he came in. And he knew that we were Timothy's family, and he never looked at us again.
Prosecutors build their case against Derek using eyewitness accounts of his previous fight with Timothy, along with ballistics analysis and security footage from the apartments.
There's video of Mr. Thurman walking through the breezeway following Mr. Hobbs. The prosecutor blew up the video and you could actually see the gun in his hand too.
There were a number of people who testified, including Mr. Hobbs' fiance and her daughter, about recognizing Mr. Thurman as the person in the video.
From him walking in the courtroom and the walk that was on the surveillance, it was the same walk, same little limp that he had. That particular night, he knew he was there, and he waited. And when he seen my brother, he hid. And he shot him.
Shot him multiple times. Then as he tried to run, he continued to shoot him. Dying in the way that he did is, is heartbreaking.
But Derek's attorneys insist he's not the man on the video, and he had nothing to do with Timothy's death.
The defense maintains that just because Derek has locks and he has the same build doesn't mean he is the person from the surveillance video. There are lots of people in the complex that could fit that description as well. Derek claimed he was in a lot of pain and he was physically incapable of shooting Timothy Hobbs.
Part of his defense claim was he couldn't have done the shooting because he was incapacitated. He couldn't move around. Well, that's not the case with a colostomy bag. People work and move around daily with them. It's not incapacitated.
When Derek takes the stand, he says the prosecution's claims about him wanting revenge are wrong, because he knew Timothy wasn't the one who shot him.
No one knew if Derek truly believed that, or if he was just trying to distance himself from Timothy's murder by eliminating a motive.
So if you knew he didn't shoot you, why did you shoot him? Why did you shoot my brother? If you knew that he didn't shoot you at the time that you got shot, why? What reason?
The trial only lasts for 3 days. On October 12, 2017, the jury gives their verdict.
Derek Thurman was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison.
I knew he was guilty because I seen him. I knew it was him on the surveillance. It was very cowardly to hide and shoot him from behind. If you have a problem with someone and, if it's resulting to that, why would you hide and shoot him?
It was a sense of wellness over me. I was happy that, he didn't get off for it. He was found guilty. But it still doesn't get rid of the hurt of losing my brother. But at the same sense, to give you some kind of sense of relief that justice was served.
Timothy was a light in his community, and it's such a tragedy his life had to end this way.
The death of Timothy Hobbs has to matter. It mattered to his daughter, it mattered to his fiance, it matters to his family, and it should matter to all of us.
I miss my brother. I miss my brother a lot. He was a good man. He was a good brother. He was a good dad. He didn't deserve what happened to him. It left a big hole in our hearts. I hate that happened. I can't change it. He didn't deserve it. He was one of the good guys.
On a cold, gray morning in rural Alberta, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the wind carries nothing but the sound of emptiness across frozen fields, there was a silence, so ordinary it felt safe, almost comforting, the kind of silence that belongs to small towns where everyone assumes nothing truly violent ever happens there, but beneath that illusion of calm, something had already shifted, something dark and deliberate that no one could yet see, a chain of decisions already set in motion that would shatter that illusion forever. Long before the first police vehicle even turned off the main road toward the isolated property outside Mayerthorpe, James Roscoe had already made his own preparations in the stillness of his land, a man known in the surrounding community not for warmth or familiarity, but for distance and hostility, someone whose presence felt like a warning rather than a greeting, a figure tied to petty crime, suspicion, and a growing history of conflict with law enforcement, yet still, in the official sense, just another file, another name in a system already overwhelmed by the vastness of rural enforcement. The farm where he lived sat like an island of neglect surrounded by fields and trees, a place where machinery rusted in plain sight and structures leaned under the weight of years without care, and it was here, in this isolation, that resentment had been allowed to grow unchecked, not in loud bursts but in slow accumulation, like pressure building under ice. The officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who were assigned to this case did not arrive with the expectation of violence, because in most routine warrant executions there was still a shared assumption that the presence of law itself would be enough to control the outcome, that procedure, training, and authority would create a predictable sequence of compliance. But what they were walking into that day had already broken away from predictability. The decision to execute a search warrant at Roscoe's property had been shaped by a series of concerns that, on paper, looked familiar. Suspected stolen vehicles, possible drug activity, and illegal firearms, all elements that individually were serious, but not uncommon in rural investigations, and the team assigned to the task was small, just 4 officers, chosen because the situation was assessed as manageable, because nothing in the paperwork could fully capture the mindset of the man they were about to confront. In the hours before they arrived, Roscoe was not waiting passively. He was preparing, positioning himself within the structures of his property, turning familiar spaces into tactical ground, a transformation invisible to anyone who had not been inside his thoughts, and by the time the officers approached the large metal Quonset hut that stood on the land like a half-buried shell, the environment had already been converted into something else entirely, no longer a farm building but a sealed space of intent. Inside that structure, there was no noise, no movement visible from the outside, only the cold geometry of metal walls and the expectation of routine inspection. But within that silence there was also concealment, a man waiting with a firearm, a rifle position not in panic but in patience, as though time itself had been measured and weaponized. The officers moved as trained professionals do, coordinated, aware of angles and entry points, their focus narrowed by procedure and the immediate necessity of securing a space that was believed to be dangerous, but not yet understood as lethal in a premeditated sense. And when they crossed the threshold into the Quonset hut, they crossed into a space where the rules they relied on no longer applied. The first shots came without warning, not as escalation but as initiation, a sudden violent rupture of silence at close range that transformed metal walls into amplifiers of impact and confusion, and in those first seconds, the idea of negotiation or control vanished completely, replaced by the raw reality of survival in an environment that had been engineered for advantage by a single individual who had already decided the outcome. The officers, Constable Peter Skeeman, Constable Anthony Gordon, Constable Brock Myrall, and Constable Leonide Johnston, were not facing a chaotic exchange of fire in an open field where movement might offer chance or cover, but instead a confined space where visibility was limited, distance collapsed, and reaction time became almost meaningless, and in that compressed geometry of violence, each decision they made was overtaken by speed they could not match. The shots continued in rapid succession, not scattered but directed, as if the space itself had been mapped in advance, each movement anticipated, each entry point already accounted for, and within moments, the encounter that had begun as a warrant execution had been transformed into an ambush so absolute that there was no pathway for retreat or regrouping. Outside, the rural landscape remained unchanged, the wind still moving through fields, the sky still overcast, birds still circling at a distance, unaware that the structure below had become a sealed endpoint for 4 lives whose final seconds were unfolding behind metal walls that gave no indication of what was happening within. When the gunfire stopped, there was no immediate understanding of its finality, only the absence of continued sound, which in such moments can feel more disorienting than the violence itself, because silence after chaos does not immediately register as conclusion, but rather as uncertainty. Roscoe did not remain to witness the aftermath in any conventional sense. His actions had already moved beyond confrontation into escape, leaving behind a scene that would require time and courage for others to enter, and when he left the structure, he disappeared into the surrounding terrain he knew intimately, a landscape that to outsiders was open and empty, but to him functioned as concealment. The initial confusion among responding units was shaped by distance, communication, and the delayed recognition that what had been expected as a controlled search had become something entirely irreversible, and as more officers arrived and the perimeter expanded, the gravity of what had occurred began to settle not as a single realization, but as a series of confirmations that accumulated slowly, each one heavier than the last. In the broader context of policing in rural Canada, this moment would later be understood not only as an isolated tragedy, but as a rupture in assumptions about safety, numbers, and preparation, because what had failed was not courage or training in isolation, but the expectation that standard procedure could contain an individual who had already committed fully to lethal resistance. And while the immediate priority shifted to containment, pursuit, and search, the emotional reality among those who first received fragments of information was something harder to articulate, a growing awareness that colleagues had walked into a space that offered no negotiation, only execution. Even before confirmation of identities or full understanding of sequence, there was already a sense of irreversible loss spreading through channels of communication, a recognition that would later become official, but in those first moments existed only as dread. The hook of this story, the moment everything bends into tragedy, is not a single gunshot or a single decision, but the convergence of isolation, preparation, and institutional expectation meeting a man who had already decided to turn his property into a trap. And in that convergence, for officers entered a structure believing they were enforcing law, and instead encountered a final act of violence that would redefine how such situations were understood for years to come, leaving behind a silence that was no longer peaceful, but permanent in the way only absence of life can be. The land outside Mayerthorpe, Alberta, does not announce itself in any dramatic way. It simply exists in vast stretches of quiet that seem to swallow sound before it can travel very far, where gravel roads cut through fields that appear endless in winter and fragile in summer, and where human presence is measured not by density, but by distance between one isolated home and the next. And in that kind of environment, law enforcement is not a constant visible force, but a moving presence that appears when called and disappears again into the horizon, leaving behind only the memory of tires on dirt and dust settling back into stillness. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police detachments that serve these regions operate under conditions that are fundamentally different from urban policing, because response times are dictated not by blocks or intersections, but by kilometers of empty road, and every call carries with it the awareness that backup is not immediate, that communication is stretched across space, and that any encounter can become self-contained long before additional support arrives. In this landscape, officers learn to read subtle signs of human behavior across long distances of geography and time, to interpret the significance of a locked gate on a rural property, a vehicle parked in an unusual position, or the absence of activity where activity should normally exist, because each of these details can become relevant when the next call turns routine observation into active investigation. The Mayerthorpe area itself sits within this framework of quiet agricultural life, a community shaped by farming cycles, seasonal work, and the kind of interpersonal familiarity that develops when people live far apart but still recognize each other's routines, where most conflicts are small, often private, and resolved without public attention, and where serious criminal activity, while not unheard of, tends to feel like something that belongs elsewhere until it suddenly does not. It was within this environment that James Roscoe existed as a figure increasingly defined not by integration but by separation, someone whose presence on the land outside town carried a reputation that had been built slowly over years of reported incidents, suspicions, and encounters with law enforcement that rarely resolved into stability. His property was not simply a residence, but a kind of isolated ecosystem of neglect and tension, a place where structures stood in various states of decay and where the boundary between legal and illegal activity was blurred by distance, secrecy, and the difficulty of sustained oversight in rural terrain. For those tasked with monitoring or investigating him, Roscoe represented a familiar but persistent challenge, the type of subject whose behavior generated files, warrants, and periodic interventions, but resisted long-term resolution due to the complexity of jurisdictional limits, resource allocation, and the sheer physical space that had to be covered to maintain consistent surveillance. Within RCMP operational planning, cases like his are not uncommon in agricultural regions, where stolen property, drug cultivation, and illegal firearms can exist in pockets of land that are difficult to observe continuously, and where the architecture of isolation itself becomes a kind of protection for those who wish to avoid attention. Yet even within this context, Roscoe stood out not necessarily for the scale of confirmed offenses at any given moment, but for the accumulation of indicators that suggested escalating hostility toward authority, a pattern of resistance that was not always direct but was increasingly embedded in his interactions, his environment, and the reports generated by those who had previously attempted to engage with his property. The RCMP officers assigned to rural detachments develop an understanding of these patterns over time, not as abstract profiles but as lived experience, where each call can range from routine enforcement to unpredictable confrontation, and where the difference between compliance and conflict is often determined in the first seconds of contact. On the surface, the decision to execute a search warrant at Roscoe's property followed standard investigative logic, grounded in information suggesting stolen vehicles, possible drug-related activity, and illegal firearms, all of which individually justify legal entry under Canadian law when properly authorized, and in many similar cases, such operations conclude without incident, with evidence collected and suspects detained or questioned under controlled circumstances. However, what does not appear in the procedural language of warrants and briefing documents is the psychological weight of approaching a property where prior knowledge is incomplete and where the subject has demonstrated signs of unpredictability, because in rural policing, the absence of immediate visual confirmation often means that assumptions must be made about unseen conditions inside buildings, barns, and outbuildings that may or may not be occupied. The team assigned to Roscoe's property was relatively small, consistent with what would normally be considered sufficient for a search operation of this type, and their preparation would have included standard tactical considerations, awareness of potential hazards, and coordination designed to ensure communication between units. But even the most thorough planning operates within the limits of available intelligence, and intelligence in such environments is often fragmented, delayed, or incomplete. The land itself plays an active role in shaping these dynamics, because rural properties are not structured like urban environments with predictable layouts and visibility, but instead consist of irregular structures, open fields, wooded areas, and improvised spaces that can conceal activity or movement in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate without direct observation. Roscoe's farm, like many in the region, contained a mix of utilitarian structures and neglected areas that had evolved over time without strict architectural order, and this lack of order, while common in agricultural settings, also creates unpredictable tactical conditions for anyone entering the space without prior interior mapping. The Quonset hut on the property, a large semicircular metal structure typically used for storage or agricultural equipment, represented one of these spaces where visibility is limited until entry, where sound behaves differently due to metal surfaces, and where spatial awareness can shift abruptly upon crossing the threshold. In rural Alberta, such structures are not inherently suspicious. They are part of the agricultural landscape, familiar and functional, but in the context of a warrant execution on a property associated with criminal suspicion, they become focal points of uncertainty because they are large enough to conceal individuals, equipment, or weapons, yet simple enough in design that their interior state cannot be fully assessed from outside. The broader setting of the case is therefore not just geographic but structural, shaped by the intersection of isolation, limited visibility, and the procedural necessity of law enforcement acting on incomplete information, and it is within this intersection that the events leading to Mayor Thorpe were set in motion. Roscoe himself had become, over time, a figure defined by resistance to external authority, someone whose interactions with law enforcement had not resolved into compliance, but into further separation, and while not every detail of his psychological state is known with certainty, the pattern of behavior attributed to him suggested increasing hostility and an unwillingness to accept intrusion into his space. In communities like Mayor Thorpe, where social structures are tightly interwoven despite physical distance, individuals who withdraw from those structures entirely become notable not only for their absence, but for the tension their absence creates. Because isolation in such environments is rarely neutral, it is often interpreted as either vulnerability or threat depending on context and history. By the time the RCMP prepared to execute the warrant, Roscoe's property was already more than just a location on a map. It was a site layered with prior interactions, assumptions, and unresolved concerns that shaped how officers would approach it, even if subconsciously, because no entry into a known high-risk rural property is ever free from the influence of what has been previously reported. The weather on that day, the seasonal conditions, the muted coloration of the landscape, and the general stillness typical of early spring in Alberta all contributed to a sensory environment in which movement stands out more sharply than sound, where vehicles on gravel roads can be heard from a distance, but human presence inside structures cannot be easily detected until directly encountered. This environmental context matters because it shapes perception, and perception in policing situations can determine how time is experienced in the moments before contact, how distances are judged, and how uncertainty is managed under pressure. The setting of Mayor Thorpe in this case is therefore not merely a backdrop, but an active component of the unfolding events, a vast quiet space that offered both concealment and exposure depending on perspective, and it is within this quiet that the tension between routine procedure and unpredictable human intent began to form into something irreversible, even before any officer physically stepped onto the property, even before any door was opened or any threshold crossed, because in cases like this, the environment itself becomes part of the equation that no briefing can fully resolve, and it is in that unresolved space between expectation and reality that the tragedy ultimately took shape. Before names became headlines and uniforms became symbols of loss, each of the 4 officers who walked toward that Quonset hut on the Roscoe property was a full human life moving through ordinary days that had nothing to do with the violence that would later define their memory in the public mind. Constable Peter Skeeman, Constable Anthony Gordon, Constable Brock Myrall, and Constable Leonide Johnston were not abstract figures of law enforcement statistics. They were people with routines, families, habits, and the quiet accumulation of experiences that form a life long before it is ever reduced to a single moment of tragedy. In the days leading up to the Mayor Thorpe operation, none of them could have known that their final assignment would place them inside a structure that had already been transformed into something lethal, because for them, like for most officers in rural detachments, duty was defined by a rhythm of calls that rarely followed predictable emotional intensity, alternating between routine enforcement, minor disputes, traffic incidents, and the occasional serious investigation that required caution, but not expectation of absolute ambush. Peter Skeeman was known among colleagues for a steady professionalism that did not draw attention to itself, the kind of officer whose reliability becomes visible only in hindsight when others begin to recount who they trusted in uncertain situations, and in environments like rural Alberta, where teams are small and interdependence is constant. That kind of steadiness is not just a personality trait, but a structural necessity. His presence in the detachment reflected years of training shaped by the idea that policing is as much about judgment as it is about action, about reading environments, assessing risk, and maintaining composure in spaces where information is incomplete. And like many officers in Canada's vast northern and western regions, he had likely experienced the quiet contrast between long stretches of uneventful duty and brief moments where everything compresses into immediate decision-making. Anthony Gordon, similarly, was part of that same operational rhythm, someone whose work existed within the balance between enforcement and community interaction, where officers are not only enforcers of law but also familiar figures in towns where residents recognize patrol vehicles and associate them with both authority and reassurance. In rural detachments, officers often build indirect relationships with the communities they serve, not through intimacy but through repetition of presence, where familiarity is created by seeing the same faces over time rather than through personal closeness, and Gordon's role would have existed within that structure of repeated engagement, where trust is slow to build and easy to disrupt. Brock Myrall, younger than some of his colleagues, represented another dimension of policing life, the stage where training is still being refined through real-world exposure, where theoretical understanding meets the unpredictable nature of human behavior, and where each call contributes to the gradual shaping of professional instinct. In environments like Mayerthorpe, younger officers often absorb the culture of their detachments through observation, learning not only procedures but also the unspoken habits of more experienced colleagues, the subtle cues about when to proceed, when to pause, and when to reassess a situation that may not yet fully reveal its danger. Lionel Johnston, like the others, was part of this collective structure of responsibility that defines our CMP rural operations, where small teams function as tightly linked units and each member's role is both individual and interconnected, meaning that the loss of one is not experienced as an isolated event, but as a rupture in the entire operational fabric. What binds these four individuals together in memory is not only the moment of their deaths, but the fact that they were operating as a coordinated team, entering a space under the assumption of procedural control, and it is within that assumption that their story becomes both deeply human and profoundly tragic, because nothing in their preparation indicated that the environment they were about to enter had already been converted into a premeditated killing zone. Outside of their professional identities, each officer carried personal histories that did not appear in operational briefings but formed the emotional foundation of their lives, relationships with family members who expected them to return home after shift, routines that continued independently of their work schedules, and future plans that existed in the quiet space between one assignment and the next. In law enforcement, especially in rural regions, there is often a tacit understanding between officers and their families that danger is a possibility, but not a constant expectation, that the work carries risk but is structured enough to remain within boundaries of predictability most of the time. And it is this psychological balance that allows officers to function in environments where uncertainty is present, but not always foreground. On the morning of the Mayerthorpe warrant execution, there would have been no outward indication that the balance was about to collapse. No environmental signal that the routine expectation of a controlled search would be replaced by immediate lethal confrontation. The preparation phase of such operations typically involves briefings that focus on known risks, suspect history, property layout if available, and communication protocols designed to ensure coordination. But even the most detailed planning cannot fully account for what is not visible or what has been deliberately concealed. The officers would have approached the assignment with the mindset shaped by experience, cautious but not anticipating guaranteed violence, alert but still operating within the framework of legal entry and search procedures that assume the possibility of compliance or at least manageable resistance. What makes the human dimension of this case particularly striking is the contrast between the ordinariness of their last movements and the absolute finality of what awaited them, because in many true crime narratives, victims are often portrayed through the lens of the crime itself, yet here, the dissonance between who they were and how they were killed becomes central to understanding the emotional weight of the event. They were not isolated strangers entering unknown territory without preparation. They were trained officers operating under institutional authority, moving as part of a coordinated unit into a property that had been legally designated for search, and it is precisely this structured legitimacy that intensifies the tragedy, because it underscores how even systems designed to manage risk can be disrupted by a single point of deliberate violence. In the rural policing environment of Alberta, officers often develop a heightened awareness of terrain, entry points, and potential concealment areas because properties are not standardized spaces, but irregular landscapes shaped by agricultural use, personal construction choices, and natural geography, and yet, even with that awareness, the assumption remains that the act of entry itself does not inherently trigger immediate lethal response. For Skeeman, Gordon, Myrall, and Johnston, the approach to the Quonset hut would have been guided by this framework of procedural expectation, where entry is followed by assessment and assessment is followed by control, a sequence that functions effectively in most situations where suspects are present, but not actively preparing for confrontation. What they could not have known was that inside that structure, the sequence had already been inverted, that assessment had already been completed from the inside, and that control had already been assigned to a single individual who had decided to eliminate the possibility of negotiation entirely. The humanity of these officers is often most clearly understood not in the moment of crisis, but in the absence of it, in the fact that they existed in a world where they likely thought about mundane concerns like shift schedules, equipment checks, weather conditions, and communication reliability, the same concerns that define the daily rhythm of policing far more often than violent encounters do. It is also important to understand that in rural detachments, the bond between officers is shaped by proximity and shared responsibility, where each member knows that the absence or injury of another directly affects operational capacity, creating a form of professional interdependence that extends beyond formal hierarchy. That interdependence means that the loss of all 4 officers in a single incident was not only a personal tragedy for their families and colleagues, but also a structural shock to the policing community in the region, altering how future operations would be conceptualized and executed. Yet before any of that broader impact could be understood, there was only the immediate reality of 4 individuals moving toward a structure that appeared static and unremarkable from the outside, carrying out a duty that, in all previous experience, would not have suggested inevitable fatality. Their story, in its most essential form, is not defined solely by the violence that ended it, but by the normalcy that preceded it, a normalcy that is often invisible in true crime narratives, but essential to understanding the full weight of what was lost, because without that context, the moment of tragedy becomes detached from the lives it interrupted, and what remains is only an event rather than the erasure of 4 ongoing human stories that, until that day, were still being written in ordinary time. By the time the RCMP team left the road and began moving deeper toward the Roscoe property, the sense of routine that had accompanied the warrant at its inception had already begun to thin, replaced not by certainty of danger, but by the quiet awareness that rural operations often shift tone gradually rather than abruptly, where nothing changes in appearance until suddenly everything does. The gravel under tires would have sounded ordinary, almost indifferent, the kind of sound that belongs to countless rural entries across Alberta where officers approach properties under legal authority expecting documentation, inspection, and controlled interaction rather than confrontation, and yet within that same ordinary motion, there is always a subtle recalibration taking place among trained officers, a shifting of attention from administrative task to environmental reading because every structure, every line of sight, every absence of movement becomes part of a silent assessment that runs parallel to procedure. Roscoe's property, seen from the outside, did not immediately reveal anything unusual in a way that would have triggered alarm on sight alone, because rural spaces rarely do. They tend to absorb human intent into their geography rather than broadcasting it, and so what might later be understood as preparation for violence can initially appear as nothing more than disorganization or neglect, features that are common in remote agricultural settings. The Quonset hut itself, a large curved metal structure, would have stood as one of several focal points on the land, its surface reflecting muted daylight in a way that offered no insight into its interior condition, and for officers trained in warrant execution, such structures are approached with awareness, but also with procedural neutrality, because they are as likely to contain machinery or storage materials as they are to conceal anything relevant to an investigation. What transforms such a structure from neutral to lethal is not its appearance, but its use. And in this case, its use had already been altered by the person waiting inside, though that fact remained invisible to those approaching it from outside. The team's movement toward the hut would have followed standard spacing and communication protocols, each officer aware of positioning relative to the others, maintaining lines of sight where possible, and preparing for entry based on the assumption that any interior space could require immediate assessment upon breach. In rural policing, the moment of entry is always a threshold of uncertainty, because until that point, all intelligence remains external, and once that threshold is crossed, information becomes immediate and irreversible. As they approached, there would have been no outward indication that the interior space had been transformed into a prepared environment of ambush, no sound that distinguished it from any other closed agricultural structure, no visible movement that would suggest human presence positioned for confrontation. And this absence of external cues is precisely what makes such scenarios so dangerous in rural operations, because visibility is often the only early indicator available. Inside the Quonset hut, however, the conditions were entirely different, though that difference could not be perceived from the outside, as the metal walls created a sealed acoustic and visual environment where anticipation could be structured without detection, and where the positioning of a firearm could be maintained in complete concealment until the precise moment of engagement. Roscoe's decision to remain inside that space rather than flee or confront earlier suggests a deliberate choice to control timing, to allow entry rather than avoid it, and in doing so, to invert the expectation that law enforcement holds the advantage during execution of a warrant. That inversion is critical to understanding the nature of what followed, because it means the officers were not walking into uncertainty alone, but into a scenario where uncertainty had already been resolved by someone else in advance. As the team reached the immediate perimeter of the structure, the procedural mindset would have shifted into entry preparation, a narrowing of attention where external environment becomes secondary to the immediate task of crossing into the interior space, and in most cases, this transition is managed through training that emphasizes speed, coordination, and clarity of movement, designed to minimize exposure and maximize control once inside. What is not present in that procedural framework, however, is the expectation that the interior itself has been weaponized as a static position of lethal force, because such a condition fundamentally alters the assumptions on which entry training is based. The transition from outside to inside is typically understood as a shift from observation to control, but in this instance, it was already a shift into exposure. The exact moment of entry is where narrative and reality converge most sharply in this case, because it represents the point at which 4 trained officers, operating under lawful authority and structured procedure, crossed into a space that had been prepared to eliminate reaction time entirely. The interior of the Quonset hut did not offer the usual transitional clarity that officers might expect upon entry, where vision adjusts, voices coordinate, and movement begins to organize the space. Instead, the environment inside had been arranged in a way that collapsed that transitional window. The presence of a concealed shooter inside a confined metal structure creates a condition where distance is effectively removed from the equation, and in such conditions, the difference between recognition and response becomes almost non-existent. When the first exchange occurred, it did not unfold as a developing confrontation, but as an immediate disruption of the entry sequence, a moment where the expected flow of movement and assessment was overtaken by sudden violence that originated from within the space itself. In enclosed environments, the acoustics of gunfire are amplified and distorted, making it difficult to distinguish direction in the first instant, and the shock of such a rupture in expectation can momentarily override even trained cognitive processing, because the human brain is still required to reclassify what is happening in real time while the situation continues to evolve faster than that classification can occur. The officers, who had entered with the intention of conducting a search, were instead confronted with a reality in which the search space itself was actively hostile, and this distinction is crucial because it removes the possibility of procedural recovery, leaving only immediate survival response in an environment that offered no spatial advantage. The confined nature of the hut meant that movement options were severely limited, and in such conditions, even small adjustments in position can become critical, yet those adjustments require time that was not available. Outside the structure, there was no immediate visual confirmation of what was happening inside, only the knowledge that entry had occurred, followed by an abrupt transformation of the situation into something no longer governed by standard communication protocols. In rural settings, delays in understanding can be measured in seconds, but those seconds carry disproportionate weight because they determine whether additional support can be coordinated or whether an incident is already beyond intervention by the time it is recognized as such. Inside the hut, the sequence of events unfolded in a compressed time frame where perception, reaction, and outcome were no longer separable processes, but overlapping fragments of a single irreversible moment. Roscoe's positioning within the structure allowed him to control visibility and timing, and once the initial engagement began, the structure itself functioned as containment, preventing dispersal and limiting escape paths. The officers' training would have guided them toward immediate response under fire, but training operates within constraints of environment, and here the environment had been engineered in advance to negate many of those assumptions. As the initial moments passed, the reality of the situation transitioned from uncertainty to confirmation that the encounter was not a standard escalation, but an ambush that had been fully realized. Outside, the rural landscape remained unchanged, continuing its ordinary rhythm without awareness of what had just occurred inside the metal structure, a contrast that underscores one of the most unsettling aspects of the incident, that violence of this magnitude can exist entirely within a space that, from the outside, offers no visible sign of its unfolding. The moment the entry was made, the structure ceased to be a neutral site of investigation and became instead the final stage of a sequence that had already been decided, and within that sequence, the boundary between procedure and catastrophe dissolved completely. In the immediate aftermath of the gunfire, there is a kind of silence that does not feel like peace but instead like interruption, as if the world itself has paused mid-function without explanation, and on the Roscoe property that silence settled over the Quonset hut and surrounding land with an almost physical weight, pressing into the space where sound had only moments earlier defined everything that was happening inside. From the outside, there was no visible indication of the precise sequence that had just unfolded within the metal structure, no dramatic change in the landscape to signal that 4 lives had ended in rapid succession, only the unchanged geometry of the rural environment, the same fields, the same muted light, the same stillness that characterizes remote Alberta when human activity briefly disappears. But for those who are part of the broader response network, the absence of communication from inside the structure quickly began to register as something more than procedural delay, because in operations like this, silence is never neutral once entry has occurred. It is interpreted through experience. And experience in law enforcement teaches that prolonged lack of contact after a planned entry often signals a breakdown in control. The first responding officers outside the immediate entry team would have been attempting to establish radio contact, their messages initially framed in the language of coordination, checking status, requesting updates, expecting confirmation that the search was proceeding according to plan, but as those messages went unanswered, the tone of uncertainty would have begun to shift, not abruptly, but gradually, as the absence of response accumulated into something heavier than technical failure. In rural policing, communication gaps can occur for benign reasons, signal interference, structural blockage, or the physical positioning of officers inside metal buildings that disrupt transmission, and so the early moments of uncertainty often exist in a space where hope and concern are still balanced, where there is no immediate reason to assume the worst, even if instinct begins to suggest otherwise. As time passed, however, that balance began to tilt, because the expected rhythm of entry operations includes feedback, even if brief, and the lack of any signal returning from inside the Quonset hut introduced a growing tension among those outside the structure, a tension that did not yet have confirmation but was beginning to form shape. The rural environment itself contributed to this psychological state, because the vastness of the surrounding land amplifies the sense of isolation during critical moments, making any delay in communication feel more pronounced than it might in an urban setting where noise, movement, and proximity provide constant external reference points. On the Roscoe property, there were none of those stabilizing references, only the structure itself standing closed and silent, its metal surface offering no insight into what had occurred within, and the waiting that followed entry became not just a procedural interval, but an increasingly unstable period of interpretation. It was during this phase that the first indications of serious deviation from expected outcome began to circulate among responding units, not as confirmed information but as fragments, partial observations, and the absence of reassuring updates, which in operational terms can be more telling than direct reports. When officers do not respond after entry into a secured search environment, the possible explanations narrow quickly in the minds of experienced personnel, and those explanations become more severe as time extends, shifting from technical issues to tactical concern, and then to potential casualty scenarios, even before any physical confirmation is possible. The emotional reality of this transition is difficult to capture in purely procedural language, because it involves the simultaneous processing of uncertainty and professional responsibility, where those outside the structure must decide how to respond to information that is incomplete but increasingly alarming. As additional units were alerted and began moving toward the location, the nature of the response changed from supportive coordination to emergent containment, and that shift carries its own psychological weight because it implies that the situation is no longer being managed according to plan, but is instead unfolding outside of anticipated control. Upon eventual approach to the Quonset hut, the exterior still offered no immediate visual confirmation of internal events, which is one of the most disorienting aspects of such incidents, because the structure that contains catastrophic violence can appear entirely unchanged from the outside, preserving its ordinary physical presence while concealing irreversible internal reality. It is only upon closer inspection, and eventually entry by additional personnel, that the full scope of what occurred begins to reveal itself, and even then, understanding does not arrive all at once but in stages, as different pieces of the scene are processed and contextualized. Inside the structure, the conditions that had allowed Roscoe to control the encounter became part of the evidentiary landscape, but at this stage of discovery, the primary focus was not analysis but recognition, the immediate and difficult confirmation that the officers who had entered were no longer responsive. That recognition is one of the most psychologically difficult moments in any law enforcement response because it transforms uncertainty into permanence, and once permanence is acknowledged, the nature of all subsequent actions changes fundamentally. Outside the hut, the broader perimeter began to expand as more RCMP units arrived, establishing control over the surrounding area, securing access points, and preparing for investigative procedures that would follow. But even as operational structure increased, there remained an underlying sense of fragmentation, because the initial team had effectively disappeared into the structure and re-emerged only through absence rather than communication. The discovery phase of the incident was not a single moment, but a sequence of confirmations that gradually removed ambiguity, each step making the reality more concrete, more difficult to process, and more irreversible. In rural environments like this, where distances are large and visibility limited, the time between incident and full understanding can feel extended, not because events are slow, but because information arrives in layers, each one changing the meaning of the previous. The Quonset hut, which had initially represented a standard search location, had by this point become the central focus of a rapidly escalating emergency response, its interior now understood not as a search space, but as the site of a completed act of extreme violence. As investigators and responding officers began to process the scene, the transition from operational uncertainty to evidentiary reality marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, where questions would shift from what is happening to what has already happened, and that shift carries with it a profound change in emotional and procedural orientation. The discovery of the outcome inside the structure did not resolve the situation immediately, but instead expanded its consequences, because confirmation of loss transforms an active operation into a recovery and investigation effort, altering priorities, communication, and the emotional landscape of everyone involved. Outside, the rural quiet that had once felt ordinary now carried a different weight, not because the environment had changed, but because perception of it had, and the same fields and structures that had earlier seemed unremarkable now existed in contrast to what had just been revealed inside the metal building. In that contrast, the true gravity of the situation began to settle, not as a single realization but as an accumulation of understanding that 4 officers had entered a structure under lawful authority and encountered a premeditated lethal ambush that left no room for reversal, and it is within that realization that the discovery phase becomes not just a procedural step, but the moment where the full cost of the incident begins to take shape. In the hours and days that followed the confirmation of what had occurred inside the Quonset hut, the investigation did not begin with clarity but with fragmentation, because even in cases where the outcome appears immediately evident, the process of understanding how and why it happened unfolds slowly through layers of evidence, testimony, reconstruction, and procedural verification that must be carefully separated from emotion. At first, there was no single narrative that explained the event in full, only overlapping fragments of information moving through different channels within the RCMP structure, each fragment carrying its own partial perspective, none of them sufficient on their own to capture the totality of what had taken place on the Roscoe property. The initial focus of investigators was necessarily practical, centered on securing the scene, ensuring that no additional threat remained active, and establishing a controlled perimeter that would allow forensic teams to begin their work without interference or contamination. In rural environments like Mayerthorpe, securing a scene of this scale is not simply a matter of closing access points, because the surrounding land itself becomes part of the operational boundary, requiring coordination across open fields, access roads, and adjacent properties that may or may not have been witnesses to any movement during the incident. As the perimeter expanded, officers were tasked not only with containment, but also with managing the emotional impact of the situation, because the confirmation that 4 colleagues had been killed in the line of duty created a psychological pressure that existed alongside procedural responsibility, a dual burden that is difficult to separate in real time. Within the structure itself, forensic examination began with careful documentation of positions, trajectories, and physical evidence that could reconstruct the sequence of events. But even before technical analysis, the most immediate and unavoidable reality was the recognition of the manner in which the officers had been positioned at the time of the attack, which indicated that they had been engaged at close range within a confined space. That spatial reality shaped every subsequent interpretation because it established that the encounter had not been prolonged or dynamic in the conventional sense, but instead compressed into a brief and decisive interval where reaction time was effectively eliminated. Outside the hut, investigators and command personnel began assembling a timeline based on radio logs, deployment records, and last known communications, attempting to identify the precise moment at which contact had been lost and how that moment aligned with the entry into the structure. But those efforts were complicated by the nature of rural communication systems, where signal interruption can occur due to terrain and structural interference, creating ambiguity in the early stages of analysis. As more information was gathered, attention inevitably turned to James Roscoe, not as an abstract suspect but as the central figure whose actions had defined the outcome, and understanding his role required revisiting prior interactions, historical records, and previous law enforcement encounters that had taken place on or near the property. Roscoe was not an unknown quantity to authorities in the region. His history included multiple interactions with law enforcement related to suspected illegal activity, and over time, these interactions had built a profile of an individual who was increasingly resistant to external authority and increasingly isolated in both behavior and environment. However, what those prior encounters did not fully capture was the extent to which that isolation may have developed into a deliberate defensive posture, where the property itself became not just a residence, but a controlled environment in which external intrusion was anticipated and prepared for in advance. Investigators examining the scene began to identify elements within the structure and surrounding area that suggested premeditation, not in the abstract sense of criminal intent, but in the practical arrangement of space and positioning that indicated the occupant had established a tactical advantage prior to the arrival of law enforcement. This realization did not immediately answer all questions, but it reframed the investigation around the concept that the officers had not entered a neutral space, but one that had been deliberately structured to influence the outcome of any entry. At the same time, attention was directed toward Roscoe's movements following the incident, because establishing his actions after the initial encounter was essential to understanding whether there was any continued threat to the surrounding area. A large-scale search operation was initiated across the property and surrounding rural terrain, involving multiple RCMP units, search teams, and aerial support where available, reflecting the urgency of locating an individual who is believed to be armed and familiar with the local geography. The vastness of the rural landscape presented immediate challenges, as natural cover such as tree lines, uneven ground, and abandoned structures provided numerous potential concealment areas, and in such environments, even a coordinated search can become prolonged due to the sheer scale of the area that must be visually and physically inspected. As the search progressed, information began to converge toward the possibility that Roscoe had not fled far from the immediate vicinity of the property, but had instead remained within the broader area, taking advantage of familiarity with terrain and the reduced visibility offered by natural cover. This possibility intensified the urgency of the operation, as it suggested proximity rather than distance, meaning that the subject of the search could still be within reach of responding officers without being immediately visible. Eventually, the search reached a conclusion not through confrontation but through discovery, when Roscoe was found deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in a separate location within the surrounding area, bringing a definitive end to the active threat phase of the incident. This discovery, while closing the immediate operational risk, did not simplify the investigation. Instead, it shifted the focus entirely toward reconstruction, because with no surviving primary suspect to provide explanation, the entire sequence of events had to be pieced together through physical evidence, environmental analysis, and procedural reconstruction. The investigative team now faced the task of determining not only how the ambush had occurred, but how it had been made possible within the constraints of prior intelligence and operational planning. This required examining the decision-making process leading up to the warrant execution, including threat assessment protocols, resource allocation, and the level of information available regarding Roscoe's behavior and property layout. In parallel, attention was given to the broader systemic context, because incidents of this nature inevitably raise questions about procedural adequacy in rural warrant execution, particularly when dealing with subjects who may have both familiarity with law enforcement patterns and access to weapons in isolated environments. However, within the immediate scope of investigation, there was also the deeply human aspect of attempting to understand how four trained officers had entered a situation that escalated so rapidly and conclusively, and this question did not have a simple answer, because it existed at the intersection of human behavior, environmental conditions, and the unpredictable nature of violent resistance. As the investigation continued, early findings began to form a clearer picture of premeditation on the part of Roscoe, but also highlighted the limitations inherent in predicting such extreme outcomes based on available intelligence alone. The evidence suggested that the structure had been used intentionally as a point of concealment and engagement, and that the timing of the officer's entry had been anticipated in a way that allowed for immediate activation of lethal force. This conclusion, while supported by physical reconstruction, carried with it significant implications for future operational planning, because it demonstrated that even routine warrant executions in rural settings could be transformed into high-risk encounters under specific conditions that are difficult to fully anticipate. As the investigative phase moved forward, the focus gradually expanded beyond the immediate incident to include broader institutional reflection, examining how communication, intelligence sharing, and tactical preparation might be adjusted in future cases to reduce exposure to similar risks. Yet beneath all procedural analysis remained the central reality that four officers had lost their lives during what was intended to be a controlled law enforcement action, and that reality continued to define the emotional and operational weight of the investigation as it progressed. The moment the investigation began to converge from scattered fragments into a coherent sequence, it was not because a single piece of evidence suddenly revealed the truth, but because multiple independent threads began pointing toward the same unavoidable conclusion: that what had happened inside the Quonset hut was not a spontaneous escalation but a deliberately structured act designed to neutralize entry at the moment it occurred, and within that realization lay the first true pivot in understanding, the shift from confusion to recognition of intent. For investigators and command personnel, This was the point where the case stopped being treated as an unpredictable fatal encounter and started being understood as a premeditated ambush embedded within a rural environment that had been shaped in advance to favor the person waiting inside it. The reconstruction of events inside the structure, based on physical evidence, positioning, and ballistic analysis, indicated that the officers had been engaged almost immediately upon entry, with little to no transitional time between crossing the threshold and encountering lethal force, which fundamentally altered the interpretation of how the operation had unfolded. In standard warrant execution scenarios, even in high-risk environments, there is an expectation of dynamic interaction, verbal commands, potential negotiation, or at minimum a sequence of observable escalation, but here, the sequence appeared compressed to the point where the entry itself became the trigger for immediate activation of violence, suggesting that the interior space had been prepared not as a place of potential confrontation but as a controlled environment designed to eliminate uncertainty in favor of a predetermined outcome. This realization shifted investigative focus toward Roscoe's preparatory actions, not in the abstract sense of criminal intent, but in the concrete arrangement of physical space, because the placement of an armed individual within a confined structure facing a predictable entry point implies a level of anticipation that goes beyond reaction and enters the domain of prearranged tactical positioning. As this understanding developed, attention turned to the broader operational framework that had led to the deployment of a relatively small team for the warrant execution, and whether the available intelligence at the time had fully captured the risk profile associated with Roscoe's property and behavioral history. In rural policing environments, risk assessment is often constrained by the limits of prior contact, and while Roscoe was known to law enforcement through previous interactions involving suspected illegal activity, the translation of that history into predictive threat modeling is not always straightforward, particularly when behavior escalates in ways that are not fully documented or observed in real time. The breakthrough in this case did not come from a single piece of forensic evidence, but from the alignment of multiple investigative streams, including radio communication timelines, entry sequence reconstruction, and spatial analysis of the structure, all of which pointed toward the same critical window of vulnerability at the moment of entry. Once that window was identified, it became clear that the officers had been exposed to maximum risk at the exact point where procedural doctrine typically assumes control is being established, and this inversion of expectation became central to understanding how the incident unfolded so rapidly. From an operational standpoint, this represented a profound failure of assumed predictability, not necessarily in terms of procedural error, but in terms of the underlying assumption that entry into a warrant location, even a high-risk one, does not inherently constitute immediate lethal exposure. The realization that this assumption had been violated so completely forced investigators and senior RCMP leadership to re-examine the structural foundations of rural warrant planning, particularly in cases involving isolated properties where subjects have both the time and space to prepare defensive positions without external observation. As analysis deepened, Roscoe's role became clearer not as a reactive participant, but as the central architect of the encounter's outcome, someone who had transformed an ordinary agricultural structure into a controlled engagement zone, using knowledge of terrain, timing, and likely police procedure to his advantage. While the exact psychological motivations behind this remain subject to interpretation, the physical evidence supported the conclusion that his actions were deliberate in design, not incidental or improvised in the moment of confrontation. This distinction was critical because it separated the incident from other forms of escalating resistance and placed it within a category of premeditated tactical ambush against law enforcement, a classification that carries significant implications for both investigative interpretation and future policy development. As this understanding solidified, the RCMP began to integrate the findings into broader operational review processes, recognizing that the conditions present at Mayerthorpe represented a convergence of factors that, while individually known, had not previously been seen in combination with such devastating outcome. These factors included geographic isolation, limited real-time intelligence, structural concealment opportunities, and the presence of a subject with demonstrated hostility toward law enforcement who also had sufficient time to prepare the environment. The breakthrough phase of the investigation was therefore not defined by the discovery of a hidden object or a single decisive clue, but by the systemic recognition of how these factors interacted to produce a situation in which standard entry protocols were insufficient to anticipate the level of resistance encountered. At the same time, investigators were careful to distinguish between understanding the mechanics of the event and assigning simplistic causality, because in complex incidents like this, there is always a risk of reducing multiple contributing elements into a single explanatory narrative that fails to capture the full operational reality. What emerged instead was a layered understanding in which procedural planning, environmental conditions, and individual intent intersected in a way that produced an outcome none of the participants on the law enforcement side had anticipated. For those within the RCMP tasked with reviewing the incident, the breakthrough was as much emotional as it was analytical, because it required acknowledging that experienced officers operating within established protocols had entered a situation where those protocols could not account for the level of prepositioned threat they encountered. This recognition carried forward into immediate discussions about training, equipment, and tactical doctrine, particularly in relation to rural warrant execution, where the distance between support units and the entry team can be significant enough to alter survival probabilities in rapidly unfolding scenarios. As the investigation moved beyond initial reconstruction, the focus began to shift toward preventing recurrence, which meant translating the specific details of Mayerthorpe into broader systemic lessons without losing sight of the human cost embedded within those details. The breakthrough, in its most important sense, was not just about understanding what Roscoe did, but about understanding how a routine operational assumption could be disrupted in such a complete and irreversible way, and once that understanding took hold, it became the foundation for every subsequent decision made in the aftermath of the incident, shaping both institutional reflection and the evolution of rural policing strategy in ways that would extend far beyond the boundaries of that single property. The legal aftermath of the Mayerthorpe incident unfolded in a way that was fundamentally different from many other criminal cases, because there was no surviving defendant to stand trial, no courtroom confrontation between prosecution and accused, and no opportunity for the judicial system to examine intent through testimony from the person most central to the act itself, which meant that justice in its traditional form could not be delivered through adversarial process, but instead had to be established through reconstruction, evidence, and institutional accountability. With James Roscoe found dead shortly after the incident, the criminal dimension of the case reached an immediate procedural conclusion, but what followed was not closure in any emotional or systemic sense, but rather a shift in focus toward forensic certainty and organizational reflection, because the absence of a living perpetrator does not eliminate the need to understand responsibility, sequence, and structural failure. Within this framework, investigators, forensic teams, and RCMP leadership had to rely entirely on physical evidence gathered from the Quonset hut and surrounding property, as well as communication logs, operational records, and witness accounts from responding officers who had been outside the immediate entry point. The scene itself became the central witness, its arrangement of objects, positions, and trajectories forming a silent but detailed record of what had occurred inside, and through careful reconstruction, the sequence of engagement was gradually confirmed in terms that could be presented to oversight bodies and internal review panels. However, the legal dimension of the case extended beyond criminal responsibility, because in the absence of a trial, questions of procedure, risk assessment, and operational decision-making became the primary focus of formal review processes, which are designed not to assign guilt in the criminal sense, but to evaluate whether existing protocols were sufficient for the conditions encountered. In this context, the RCMP initiated internal and external inquiries aimed at understanding whether the deployment of a 4-officer team for the warrant execution had adequately reflected the known risk profile of the subject and the property, and whether additional precautions or resources could have altered the outcome. These inquiries examined the intelligence available prior to the operation, including Roscoe's history of criminal activity, prior interactions with law enforcement, and any indicators that might have suggested elevated threat potential beyond what was formally recorded. At the same time, the review process had to grapple with the inherent limitations of predictive policing in rural environments, where information is often incomplete, fragmented, or based on historical rather than real-time data, making it difficult to fully anticipate sudden shifts in behavior or escalation into extreme violence. As the investigative findings were compiled, they were presented to oversight structures within the RCMP and to governmental review bodies responsible for evaluating policing standards and officer safety protocols, and it was within these forums that the broader implications of the Mayerthorpe incident began to take shape. The absence of a trial meant that public understanding of the event was shaped more heavily by official reports, inquiries, and media reconstruction than by courtroom testimony, and this placed additional responsibility on institutional reports to provide clarity not only about what happened, but about what could be learned from it. One of the most significant outcomes of these reviews was the recognition that rural warrant execution involving potentially armed and isolated subjects required a reassessment of risk stratification, particularly in cases where the physical environment could be manipulated in advance to create tactical disadvantage for entry teams. This led to discussions about whether team size, equipment readiness, and backup positioning protocols should be adjusted in similar future operations, especially in geographically isolated areas where response time from additional units can be significantly delayed. The legal and procedural aftermath also involved examination of communication systems used during the operation, including radio reliability in metal structures and terrain-influenced signal disruption, because the inability to maintain continuous contact during critical moments was identified as a factor that limited real-time situational awareness for command personnel outside the structure. While these technical and procedural evaluations were taking place, there remained a parallel dimension of the aftermath that existed outside formal reports, centered on the families of the 4 officers who had lost their lives. For them, the courtroom did not provide resolution because there was no sentencing phase, no testimony from an accused individual, and no structured adversarial process through which events could be publicly contested or explained in detail by the perpetrator, which left the burden of understanding distributed across investigative summaries and institutional acknowledgement. In such cases, justice is often expressed through recognition of sacrifice, formal honors, and the establishment of memorials that acknowledge service and loss, and in the wake of Mayerthorpe, these forms of recognition became an important part of how the RCMP and broader Canadian public processed the event. Ceremonies and commemorations served not as closure but as structured remembrance, creating space for collective acknowledgement of the officers' deaths while reinforcing the institutional commitment to understanding how such an outcome could be prevented in the future. Within the RCMP itself, the incident became a defining case study in rural policing risk, influencing training discussions, operational planning, and tactical doctrine revisions that emphasized heightened awareness of environmental control factors and the potential for prepositioned threats in isolated structures. The legal aftermath also reinforced the importance of balancing procedural necessity with adaptive risk assessment, particularly in situations where standard warrant execution frameworks may not fully account for adversaries who actively shape the environment prior to law enforcement entry. At the same time, there was a careful effort within official reporting to avoid simplistic attribution of failure, because the investigation did not conclude that a single decision or individual action caused the tragedy, but rather that a convergence of environmental, procedural, and adversarial factors produced an outcome that exceeded the assumptions embedded in standard operational planning. This distinction was essential in shaping both internal and public understanding because it acknowledged the complexity of the event while still identifying areas where systemic improvements could be made. In the absence of a traditional courtroom resolution, the concept of justice in this case became distributed across multiple layers, including investigative truth, institutional accountability, and procedural reform, each addressing different dimensions of the aftermath, without fully resolving the emotional weight carried by those directly affected. The Mayerthorpe case thus stands within Canadian legal and policing history not as a matter concluded by verdict, but as an event that continues to inform policy, training, and institutional memory, where the justice achieved is measured less in judicial outcomes and more in the enduring commitment to understanding how 4 officers came to be placed in a situation where routine enforcement transformed into irreversible loss within a matter of moments. In the years that followed Mayerthorpe, the physical location of the Quonset hut remained unchanged on the rural Alberta landscape, its curved metal frame still standing against wind, snow, and seasonal silence. But for those who understood what had happened there, the space was no longer just part of the agricultural environment. It had become a fixed point of memory where routine geography intersected permanently with irreversible loss. In true crime cases, there is often a temptation to search for meaning that can simplify events into clear moral categories, to identify a single cause or a single failure that can explain everything that followed. But Mayerthorpe resists that kind of simplification because what occurred there was not the result of one isolated decision, but the convergence of multiple conditions that aligned in a way that produced an outcome far beyond what any individual participant could have fully anticipated in isolation. For the families of Constable Peter Skeeman, Constable Anthony Gordon, Constable Brock Myrall, and Constable Leonide Johnston, the passage of time did not transform the event into something distant or resolved, but instead created a different kind of permanence, where absence became part of daily life and memory became the only space where presence could still exist. The official recognition of their service through memorials and institutional remembrance provided a structured form of acknowledgement. Yet such gestures exist alongside grief rather than replacing it, because public honor cannot replicate the private reality of loss experienced in homes where a knock on the door changed everything in a single moment. Within the RCMP, Mayerthorpe became more than a case file or an incident report. It became a defining reference point in discussions about rural operational risk, shaping how future warrant executions were evaluated, how threat levels were interpreted, and how assumptions about environmental control were challenged in training environments that sought to prepare officers for conditions where predictability could no longer be taken for granted. The lessons drawn from the incident were not limited to tactical adjustments, but extended into broader reflections about the nature of policing in vast rural territories, where distance itself becomes a factor in safety, where isolation can amplify both opportunity and vulnerability, and where the boundary between routine enforcement and extreme violence can sometimes collapse without warning when a subject actively reshapes the environment in advance of contact. Over time, procedural reforms emphasized increased attention to intelligence gathering, enhanced communication reliability, and more cautious assessment of properties where prior indicators suggest potential for ambush-style resistance. Yet, even with these changes, the underlying uncertainty inherent in human behavior cannot be fully eliminated, only managed through preparation and awareness. What Mayerthorpe ultimately revealed to policing institutions was not a single flaw to be corrected, but a structural reality that cannot be fully resolved through procedure alone, that law enforcement often operates in environments where information is incomplete, where subjects retain initiative, and where the moment of entry into a space remains one of the most critical and vulnerable phases of any operation. For the broader public, the incident became a somber reminder of the risks carried by officers who serve in rural and remote communities, where visibility is limited, response times are extended, and the expectation of routine can sometimes be disrupted by the unpredictable nature of human intent. Yet, even beyond institutional learning and public awareness, the most enduring aspect of Mayerthorpe is the way it exists in memory not as a single image, but as a layered understanding of how quickly ordinary procedural action can be transformed into irreversible consequence, and how behind every uniform is a person whose life continues outside of duty until the moment it no longer does. The land itself does not remember in the human sense, but those who return to it with knowledge of what occurred experience it differently, as if the space carries an invisible weight that does not alter its physical appearance, but changes its meaning forever. In reflecting on Mayerthorpe, it becomes clear that the tragedy is not contained within the brief minutes of violence inside the Quonset hut, but extends into the assumptions that preceded it and the consequences that followed it, shaping policy, training, and collective memory in ways that continue to influence how similar situations are approached today. And while investigations, reports, and reforms can document what happened and adjust future responses, they cannot fully restore what was lost in that moment when 4 officers crossed a threshold believing they were entering a controlled search environment and instead encountered a final, irreversible reality. In the end, Mayerthorpe remains not only a case in the history of Canadian policing, but a lasting reminder of the fragility embedded within moments of transition, where routine becomes risk, where procedure meets unpredictability, and where the difference between expectation and reality can be measured in seconds that change everything permanently. In looking back at Mayerthorpe, What remains most difficult to fully absorb is not only the scale of what happened, but the quiet simplicity of how it began, because nothing in the outward appearance of that morning suggested that it would become one of the most defining tragedies in Canadian policing history, and that gap between appearance and outcome is where the deepest unease continues to sit. The rural landscape of Alberta does not change to reflect human events. Fields remain fields, metal structures remain standing, and roads continue to stretch through empty space as they did before, yet for those who understand the history of that particular property, the meaning of those ordinary elements has been permanently altered, as if memory has been layered onto geography in a way that cannot be removed. The story of James Roscoe and the 4 RCMP officers does not resolve into a clean moral equation, because it is not built from a single cause that can be isolated and corrected, but from a convergence of environment, human intent, procedural limitation, and timing that aligned in a way no one involved could have fully seen in advance. Roscoe's actions, viewed through investigation, reveal deliberate preparation of space and positioning, an attempt to control the moment of entry and eliminate the advantage typically held by law enforcement during warrant execution, and yet even that explanation does not fully capture the broader context in which such a transformation of a rural property into a lethal environment becomes possible. At the same time, the officers who entered that structure were operating within established frameworks of training and procedure, frameworks designed for risk management, but still dependent on the assumption that entry into a space does not automatically equate to immediate, unavoidable exposure to lethal force, an assumption that in Mayor Thorpe was broken in the most irreversible way. What lingers most strongly in the aftermath is the recognition that all systems built around human safety, no matter how carefully constructed, still rely on predictions about human behavior that can never be complete, because no procedural model can fully account for the decision of an individual to convert an environment into a fixed point of ambush with the intent to eliminate response time entirely. In the institutional memory of the RCMP, Mayor Thorpe became a reference point not because it was the first time officers were placed in danger, but because it exposed the limits of expectation in rural warrant execution, forcing a reconsideration of how intelligence, environment, and team deployment intersect when dealing with isolated properties and potentially armed individuals. Training doctrines were adjusted, communication protocols were re-examined, and risk assessment frameworks were refined, all in an effort to reduce the likelihood of similar scenarios. Yet even these changes exist within the understanding that policing will always involve uncertainty, because it is fundamentally an interaction with human behavior, and human behavior cannot be fully predicted or contained. For the families of the fallen officers, the passage of time has not transformed the event into something that feels distant or abstract, because absence does not fade in the same way that public attention does. Instead, it becomes integrated into daily life as a permanent condition, where milestones, memories, and ordinary moments are experienced in relation to what is no longer present. Public remembrance ceremonies and institutional honors provide acknowledgement and respect, but they exist alongside grief rather than replacing it, offering structure for collective memory without diminishing the private reality of loss that continues long after official narratives are complete. In broader public understanding, Mayor Thorpe serves as a reminder of the risks inherent in policing rural and remote regions, where distance, isolation, and environmental openness create conditions that differ significantly from urban settings, and where the margin for response in critical moments can be extremely narrow. Yet beyond policy, beyond procedure, and beyond institutional reflection, the most enduring aspect of the case is the human dimension. The fact that 4 individuals went to work on a routine assignment and did not return, and that their final moments were shaped by circumstances that unfolded faster than communication, faster than reinforcement, and faster than the systems designed to support them could react. The Quonset hut still stands in that landscape, unchanged in structure, but transformed in meaning, a physical object that contains within its history a moment where routine law enforcement intersected with deliberate violence in a way that permanently altered how similar spaces are approached and understood. Mayor Thorpe does not offer closure in the conventional sense, because closure implies an endpoint where understanding feels complete and consequences feel contained, but what remains instead is a continuing awareness that some events exist not as finished stories, but as lasting points of reference, shaping policy, memory, and perception long after the immediate details have been recorded. And in that ongoing reflection, the true weight of the incident is not only in what was lost, but in the reminder of how quickly ordinary duty can become irreversible history when human intent and vulnerable conditions converge in the same moment. In the years that continue to pass since Mayerthorpe, the case has not faded into obscurity the way many incidents of rural violence eventually do, because it carries within it a combination of elements that remain permanently relevant to policing, human behavior, and the fragile boundary between routine enforcement and extreme unpredictability. And as time moves forward, that boundary becomes less about a specific event and more about an enduring lesson that continues to shape how similar situations are understood. Within the RCMP and broader Canadian policing culture, Mayerthorpe is not simply remembered as a tragedy, but as a turning point in awareness, a moment where assumptions that had quietly supported rural warrant execution were exposed to conditions that made those assumptions insufficient, not because they were wrong in principle, but because they could not fully account for the possibility of a subject deliberately transforming a familiar environment into a controlled lethal space. This realization has continued to influence training and operational planning, particularly in areas where isolation, limited communication, and structural concealment intersect, and where officers must now approach similar environments with an increased emphasis on dynamic risk assessment rather than static procedural expectation. Yet, even as procedures evolve, the fundamental reality remains unchanged, that law enforcement operates within a domain where certainty is never absolute, and where every entry into a space carries with it a degree of unknown that cannot be fully eliminated regardless of preparation. The story of Mayerthorpe therefore exists not only in the details of what happened on that property, but in the broader reflection it forces about how institutions respond to rare but extreme failures of assumption, and how they attempt to adapt without losing the functional necessity of routine enforcement. At the same time, the human dimension of the case continues to define its emotional weight far more than any procedural analysis ever could, because behind every operational review and policy adjustment are 4 individual lives that were interrupted in a single moment that left no opportunity for return. For their families, colleagues, and communities, the passage of time has created a form of continuity with absence rather than resolution, where remembrance becomes an ongoing process rather than a concluded chapter, and where anniversaries serve as markers not of closure, but of persistence. In public memory, Mayerthorpe has also taken on a symbolic role, representing both the dedication of officers who serve in remote and often unpredictable environments and the inherent risks that accompany that service, particularly in regions where distance and isolation amplify the consequences of sudden violence. Over time, the case has been studied, analyzed, and revisited in training contexts, not to dwell on its tragedy but to understand its structure, because within its structure lie lessons about communication delays, environmental control, threat recognition, and the limits of predictive intelligence when confronted with human intent that actively resists external intervention. Yet, even with all of this analysis, there remains an element that cannot be fully captured through institutional language, which is the abruptness with which ordinary duty can transition into irreversible loss, a transition that, once understood, alters how similar moments are approached in both policy and instinct. The physical setting itself, the rural Alberta landscape where the event took place, remains largely unchanged, continuing its seasonal cycles without acknowledgement of the history embedded within it, and this contrast between environmental continuity and human rupture is part of what makes the case so persistently difficult to fully integrate into simple narratives. The Quonset hut still stands as a structure of agricultural utility, yet for those aware of its history, it carries a different meaning, one that cannot be separated from the memory of what occurred inside it, even though time continues to move forward around it. In reflecting on Mayerthorpe today, what becomes most evident is that its significance is not confined to the moment of violence or the immediate aftermath, but extends into the ongoing way it shapes understanding of risk, responsibility, and the limits of procedural certainty in environments where unpredictability is always present. It serves as a reminder that even well-established systems built on training, coordination, and experience remain vulnerable to situations where a single individual's deliberate actions can disrupt all expectations, and that such disruptions, while rare, have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate event. Ultimately, Mayerthorpe remains in institutional and public consciousness not because it can be neatly explained or resolved, but because it resists simplification, standing instead as a permanent point of reflection on the nature of policing, the unpredictability of human intent, and the enduring impact of moments where routine and tragedy intersect without warning, leaving behind lessons that continue to be studied long after the sound has faded and the landscape has returned to its quiet, unchanged surface. When Mayerthorpe is discussed in later institutional reviews, training rooms, and operational briefings, it is rarely treated as a single isolated failure or a story with a neat conclusion, but instead as a layered case study that continues to generate questions even years after the physical evidence has been fully processed and the immediate operational response has long ended. Because what remains is not uncertainty about what happened, but an ongoing effort to understand how a routine warrant execution could collapse so completely within such a short span of time. The RCMP's internal reflections on the incident have consistently returned to the same central tension, the gap between procedural expectation and environmental reality, where established methods of entry and control were met with conditions that had been deliberately shaped to negate those assumptions at the moment of contact. In that sense, Mayerthorpe is not only about one property or one suspect, but about the broader structural challenge of policing vast rural regions where geography itself becomes part of the operational equation, where isolation increases both concealment and vulnerability, and where the distance between units can turn seconds into decisive thresholds that cannot be bridged in time once an incident begins to unfold. Over time, this understanding has influenced how risk is communicated within law enforcement agencies, encouraging a more cautious interpretation of intelligence that suggests potential fortification, ambush risk, or adversarial familiarity with police procedures, particularly in environments where subjects have had extended time to observe, anticipate, or prepare for enforcement action. Yet, even as protocols evolve, there is an acknowledgement within the policing community that no system can fully eliminate unpredictability because human intent remains the most variable and least controllable element in any operational scenario, and Mayerthorpe stands as a stark illustration of how that variability can manifest with irreversible consequences. Beyond institutional analysis, the case also continues to exist in a space of public memory that is shaped not only by official reports but by the emotional resonance of loss, where the names of the 4 officers have become permanently associated with the location and the event, forming a collective reference point that represents both service and sacrifice. In communities across Canada, particularly within law enforcement families, Mayerthorpe is often referenced not for its technical details but for what it symbolizes: the understanding that even routine assignments can carry latent risks that are not always visible until it is too late to respond. This symbolic weight is reinforced by the way the incident is taught and revisited, not as a moment of procedural condemnation but as an example of complexity, where multiple factors aligned in a way that exceeded the predictive capacity of standard assessment models, forcing a reconsideration of how preparation and caution are balanced in environments where visibility is limited and response time is constrained. At the same time, there is a careful effort in official discourse to avoid reducing the event to a single explanatory cause, because doing so would obscure the broader reality that it emerged from a convergence of environmental conditions, individual intent, and operational assumptions, each of which played a role in shaping the final outcome without any one factor being solely responsible. The physical site itself remains a silent participant in this ongoing reflection, unchanged in its material form, yet transformed in meaning for those who understand its history, serving as a reminder that locations can become permanently associated with human events in ways that outlast the events themselves. In examining Mayerthorpe from a distance of time, It becomes clear that its lasting significance lies not only in what occurred during those critical moments inside the Quonset hut, but in the way those moments continue to influence decision-making, training philosophy, and institutional awareness across policing systems that must constantly adapt to environments where certainty can never be fully guaranteed. The lessons drawn from the incident are therefore not static conclusions, but evolving considerations, revisited as new technologies, communication methods, and tactical approaches are developed, each one tested against the enduring question of whether they can reduce vulnerability in situations where subjects may actively shape their environment in advance of engagement. Yet, even with these ongoing developments, there remains a recognition that some aspects of Mayerthorpe cannot be fully resolved through procedure alone, because at its core it reflects the unpredictable intersection of human behavior and operational necessity, where decisions made in preparation meet conditions that cannot always be fully anticipated. In that intersection lies the reason why the case continues to be studied, not because it offers a final answer, but because it forces continuous engagement with questions about risk, responsibility, and the limits of preparedness in real-world enforcement scenarios. For those who study it, teach it, or remember it, Mayerthorpe is not a closed chapter but a continuing reference point, a reminder that even in structured systems designed for safety and control, there remain moments where outcomes cannot be reversed once initiated, and where the consequences of those moments extend far beyond the immediate scene into the collective understanding of what it means to serve in environments shaped by uncertainty, distance, and human unpredictability.